So doesn't evolution disprove Genesis 1? So great question. I think, again, this is where if someone were to ask you this question, I would first say, well, what do you mean by evolution, right? If you want to say that things change over time, and we all can look in here and see our skin tones are different, we can say, yeah, I don't see anything wrong with that, right? If you want to say that within a certain animal type, there are variations that adapt to their environment, I think we find that to be true. I mean, look at a polar bear, for example. So that's not what we're concerned about. Usually when people mention evolution, they're concerned about neo-Darwinian evolution, which means that molecules over time, over really just time, completely unguided, right, ends up being conscious, rational thinking beings like you and I. I am not on board with that, okay? Simply because it just does not ultimately pass the rationality test, right? That something that's unconscious can eventually become conscious. We find that in nowhere, in anything, a rock will always be a rock. It will never mysteriously gain some type of consciousness unless God does it for some reason, right? Bible also talks about the rocks crying out. So it's not impossible if God does it, but naturally we're talking about neo-Darwinian evolution here from a previous non-living state to all of a sudden a living state. Now that's a little bit of a nugget here, and I'm going to spend a little time on this question because it's packed. I'm going to get to the actual Genesis 1 part here. Evolution, as far as I have studied, only explains what happens once we already have life. It doesn't explain how non-living things became living, right? So that's one part. You cannot get life from non-living sources. As a matter of fact, when I was doing some of my studies in philosophy, I worked on a paper, and it was actually, and don't get carried away by this, okay? This isn't the point of the answer, but this is part of my studies. I was doing a study, and I was making an argument against abortion. And I was trying to say that life began in the womb. That was my argument. And so this was right around the time that my daughter was born. So we were at Vanderbilt, and we spent a couple of days there. And I didn't know exactly who to ask because, you got doctors going in and out. And then there was finally 2 doctors came in, a younger doctor and then an older guy, right, with the white hair. And he was kind of in charge, right? And I looked at his little tag and it said, PhD, MD. So this is different from the rest of the guys. So I was like, that's my guy. So I kind of pulled him off to the side and I asked him about my argument. I said, hey, I'm trying to make this argument that life begins in the womb. And this is what he said, and it just blew my mind. He said, life does not begin in the womb. He said, life is passed through the womb. You guys get that? It's passed through the womb. Life is already here. God is the ultimate source of life. And when he breathes, in Genesis, he said, it breathes the breath of life into mankind. And there it is right there. Life is going. It's continuing to go. Life didn't have a beginning because God is eternal. He is the source of all life. So that just blew my mind there. So really, what we have to understand is, at some point on this earth, there was no life. 0. Okay? How does non-living material turn into living material without God saying, let there be life? I don't know the answer to that. And some people might say, well, science will figure it out. Well, science doesn't figure out anything. People figure out things by using science, right? So now we're putting our faith, that's an important word, right? We're putting our faith in science, whereas there's a rational answer there. I'm going to pause too. I'm double sidetracked here. I will get back to the answer. Faith. So the word faith originally came from the Latin word fides. It's the same word we would use for fidelity, right? Trust, Fidelity Bank, Trust Bank. That's kind of where that word came from, faith. So when we say we're putting our faith into something, I put my faith in my seatbelt, right? Because if I get hit, right, I'm trusting my seatbelt, right? And that's the same thing when we say I put my faith into God, I'm trusting my God, I'm trusting God. When I put faith in my spouse, we're trusting our spouse. So that's what I don't want, there's a narrative out there that faith means blind faith. That's absolutely not what faith is. It's not blind faith, it's real faith, all right? It's faith based on reason, all right? So, does evolution disprove Genesis 1? Of course, my answer is no. one thing I like to do is I say, okay, what if evolution was true? Would it still say God didn't exist? The answer is no. Even if you granted evolution, the best hope for evolution would be God, to explain how a self-replicating molecule eventually formed into the human beings that come out to be you and I. Here are a couple of problems with evolution. The first problem with evolution is the fossil record, okay? The fossil record. So when Darwin did all of this research back in 1860, right, he thought that eventually as we dig, we'll find these transitional fossils. So an argument would be that if monkeys eventually turned into mankind, that there was a period where there was an in-between state of monkey and mankind. Or even certain other animals, like if a fish would have turned into an alligator, or you know, as this evolution would come, we'd see these transitional fossils. All right, well, we never found them. We've never found these. There's about one or two that scientists don't really know what they are. They think they're transitional, but out of 150 plus years since Darwin, we really haven't found these transitional fossils, and we're far beneath the layers that Darwin thought we'd find them as well. So the fossil record isn't there. As a matter of fact, here's what the fossil records show. The fossil records show from what's called a Cambrian explosion. This is something you guys, you should write it down, look at it, Cambrian explosion. What this shows is when they got to a certain layer up under the ground, that what they find is that fossils all of a sudden began to appear. So all these things suddenly showed up at one time. And so that furthermore validates when God says, let the animals rise forth, right? So we have a sudden appearance of animals. We don't have a gradual appearance of animals. So that's one thing. In fact, fossil records does not support evolution, and it does support Christian theism, right? Here's the second thing about evolution. The second problem is this thing called irreducible complexity. Sounds like an important term, but it's not that bad, right? Irreducible complexity basically says that there are certain designs in our body that are irreducibly complex, meaning it cannot be, all the pieces have to be there at once. It couldn't gradually get there over time or else the system would fail, right? So if you think about a mousetrap, I'm kind of maybe dating myself here, but most of you guys in here have seen an old school mousetrap, right? You can't have the mousetrap unless all the pieces are there and locked in and coordinated at the same time. Or the old tube TVs, right? They don't work at all unless all the pieces are there. And we have systems in our body, specifically the human eye. Ming Wang, who has a vision center down in Vanderbilt. Ming Wang came from communist China, and he came to Christ when he got to America because of the evidence behind the human eye. He said Ming Wang he's one of the foremost eye surgeons in the world. And he was like, there's no way this eye could come together gradually over time. All the pieces have to be there at once. Now, even if you grant that all the pieces eventually came there over time, there had to be something that strived for it. There has to be a layer of intentionality in there. And once you put intentionality in there, then you have a mind. Chairs and rocks and trees, they don't have intentions. Only a mind, only a person has intentions. So, again, I don't believe that evolution disproves Genesis 1. I believe the best chance for evolution is if God existed and guided it and directed it. All right, but I do believe that Genesis 1 is true. Genesis 1 shows God creating and ordering our universe. And it was funny, there was a debate I was watching kind of to prepare for this, and the debater on the non-believer side had never truly read Genesis 1. It was a 2-day debate. And so they were debating over creation, and they realized this guy never read Genesis 1, right? And so the theist said, hey, go read Genesis 1 and we'll debate again the next day. The non-believer said, how did the author know? How did he know? So we have a document written 3,500 years ago that said there was first nothing, then there was a flash of light, then there was chaos, then there was order, then the planets were formed, there were plant life, animal life, then human life. And that's exactly what we find today. 3,500 years ago, it was already written in the Bible. Maybe if we would have took the Bible a little bit more serious, we would have discovered it earlier. So that's kind of my response there to whether or not evolution disproves Genesis.